The wine glasses were clinking. Polished silver trays floated across the room, balancing shrimp cocktail skewers and stuffed olives. Laughter echoed through the open concept living room of the Whitman estate, bouncing off marble countertops and high vaulted ceilings like it had nothing better to do. I stood near the fireplace, half listening to a conversation about venture capital that I wasn't invited into, even though it was my husband's company they were discussing. Daniel, of course, was thriving. Tan, charming, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back like I was a prized statue to be admired and then ignored. We were 2 years into marriage and 3 months into this new house, his father's gift to us, along with the unspoken condition that it would be our house, but his rules. The party wasn't just a housewarming. It was an inspection, an evaluation by Richard Whitman, lawyer, investor, local legend, and my father-in-law. Everything in his world was calculated. The guest list curated, the wine imported. Even the string quartet in the corner had been handpicked for their ability to blend into the background while still being expensive enough to impress. And I was just another item on display. "Rachel!" Richard called, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of conversation. "Come here for a moment, would you?" I walked over with a smile I'd rehearsed, the kind that said, "I'm fine, I belong, I know how this works." He stood beside the kitchen island, wine glass in hand, surrounded by a semicircle of guests hanging on his every word. The topic, as always, was legacy and power. "I was just telling everyone how impressive Daniel has been with the Whitman account expansion," Richard said. "Truly a chip off the old block." He turned to me, smiling that lawyer's smile, polished, professional, predatory. "And Rachel here," he added, "was studying literature, right? Or was it poetry? Something very expressive." There was a pause, a collective smirk. I kept my tone light. Communications, actually. I focused on digital branding strategy. "Ah, yes," Richard said, feigning memory. "And now you're, what is it again? Helping small businesses with their Instagram pages." The laughter came easily, controlled. Just enough to humiliate me without scandal. My cheeks burned, but I nodded. "Yes, I help startups find their voice and audience." He swirled his wine. "Daniel always said you were creative. Just goes to show, every empire needs someone to do the marketing, too." More chuckles. Someone said, "Better than being a trust fund wife, I suppose," and Richard nodded like it was praise. I glanced at Daniel. He didn't even flinch, just kept sipping his champagne, eyes darting toward the hedge wall where someone from his old prep school was waving him over. I stood there frozen, my smile beginning to crack at the edges. They didn't want a daughter-in-law. They wanted a mascot. And the worst part, I had volunteered for it. I'd walked right into this gilded trap, thinking I could build a life here, thinking Daniel saw me, respected me. But in this moment, surrounded by designer suits and artificial smiles, I realized something I couldn't unhear. Richard wasn't joking. He was setting the tone, letting everyone know exactly where I stood in the Whitman hierarchy, right below the shrimp cocktail. And Daniel, he was fine with it. I excused myself quietly, slipping down the hall to the guest bathroom, closed the door, leaned against the sink, and finally allowed my hands to shake. Not because I was weak, but because I knew this wasn't the beginning of a marriage anymore. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The next morning, I woke up in a house that wasn't mine. It was my name on the deed, yes, at least partially, but nothing else about the place ever truly belonged to me. The furniture was chosen by Richard's decorator. The art on the walls, abstract oil paintings from artists I'd never heard of, selected for their resale value, not emotional resonance. Even the scent diffusers had been preset to Mediterranean pine, because Margaret Whitman believed it smelled like generational wealth. I sat at the edge of the bed, Daniel still snoring beside me, and thought, how did I get here? It wasn't a mystery, really. It had all started with small compromises. Back when Daniel and I first got engaged, I was working at a boutique creative agency in Houston, climbing slowly but steadily. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Then came the dinner with his parents, the night Margaret looked me up and down and said, "She's pretty, Daniel. Not what I expected, but she'll do." That night should have been a warning. Instead, I took it as a challenge. I started molding myself into the image of the Whitman woman. Poised, supportive, elegant, deferential. I learned which fork to use at 10-course dinners. I memorized Richard's law firm partners, wives' names, and their gluten intolerances. I stopped wearing floral prints, too juvenile, Margaret said, and switched to muted neutrals and stiff shoulder dresses that made me feel like a mannequin. I smiled through every belittling comment. Every time Richard dismissed my career as a passion project. Every time Margaret introduced me as Daniel's lovely wife, without ever using my actual name. I told myself this was what building a family meant. Adjusting, sacrificing, smoothing the edges. But the truth? I wasn't building a family. I was auditioning for approval in a theater that had no intention of casting me. I remember one afternoon at brunch, maybe a year into our marriage, Margaret asked me to pass the sugar and then casually added, "Do you ever think about taking a few classes in finance or economics? Just so you can keep up a dinner." Daniel laughed like she was being helpful. I laughed too, then cried later in the laundry room. Still, I tried. I hosted charity galas for Margaret's friends, planned wine tastings with caterers Richard approved of, even stopped booking my own clients just so I'd be more available for family events. They didn't demand it. That was the genius of it. They simply made it clear that everything else was more important than me. And Daniel, he never told me to stop. He just stopped noticing when I did. He used to ask about my day. Now he barely looked up from his phone when I entered the room. One night, after a particularly grueling dinner party with a senator's daughter and a venture capitalist from New York, I curled up on the bathroom floor, too nauseated to sleep. Daniel came in, saw me lying there, and instead of concern, he asked, "Are you sick or just being dramatic?" That was the moment something shifted. It wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. This man, this family, wasn't waiting for me to rise. They were waiting for me to disappear. Quietly, elegantly, with grace. But I had spent too many years erasing myself already. I didn't know it then, but something inside me had started to stir. A voice I hadn't heard in years whispering, "You don't owe them silence." Still, I wasn't ready to listen. Not yet, because I still believed, deep down, that if I tried just a little harder, they might finally let me in. They might finally see me as more than a placeholder. And so I smoothed my dress, fixed my makeup, and returned to the table. Because being the perfect daughter-in-law was all I had left. Until it wasn't. It started with the spreadsheets, dozens of them scattered across Daniel's office like confetti from a party I wasn't invited to. I found them one afternoon while searching for a receipt. I hadn't planned to snoop. Honestly, I was trying to figure out which vendor had overcharged us for the floral arrangements at Margaret's charity auction. But as I scrolled through one of the Excel files Daniel had lazily left open, a sinking feeling began to form in my stomach. Something wasn't right. The numbers didn't add up. The personal account totals looked off. Our supposed financial strain didn't reflect in our spending. Daniel had told me we were close to defaulting on one of our mortgages, insisted we needed to tighten the belt. That was why he asked me to cash out one of the investment funds I'd built before we married. He framed it as a short-term favor. "Just a bridge, Rachel," he'd said, pressing a kiss to my temple like reassurance was currency. "I'll pay you back in a month." I'd wired him $45,000 without hesitation. I loved him. That was the last time I ever did something financial without reading the fine print. The files told a different story. Luxury purchases, private flights, offshore transfers, none of which I'd ever been a part of, and not a single mention of repayment. I felt like I was reading the diary of a man I didn't recognize, someone who wasn't floundering but feeding off me. That night, I confronted him gently, cautiously. I waited until after dinner, set down my fork, and said, Daniel, I looked at the files. Can we talk about the accounts? He didn't blink, didn't even look surprised. Instead, he sighed, deeply, theatrically, and said, "You weren't supposed to see those." Then, without missing a beat, he pivoted. "You're making this about trust? Rachel, I've been carrying this entire family financially. The least you can do is back me up when things get tight. You think it's fun asking my wife for money? It's humiliating." I stared at him, heart pounding. "But you said we were broke." "We are," he said, voice rising. "Broke in terms of liquidity. You wouldn't understand. It's a corporate thing." Ah, there it was again. That same condescension Richard wore like cufflinks. Daniel wasn't just lying. He was rehearsing. This wasn't a slip-up. This was a script. Later that week, I overheard part of a phone call between Daniel and his father. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the door to Daniel's office was ajar and his voice carried. "She's getting suspicious," he said. Then a pause. "Yeah, I know. I'll keep her distracted." My blood went cold. Distracted? Like I was some child to pacify with flowers or a spa day. I waited until he left for a weekend conference in Scottsdale, one of many, and made an appointment with a financial advisor. Someone outside the Whitman circle. What she found made my head spin. Multiple hidden accounts. Several LLCs with Daniel listed as primary beneficiary. And, most telling of all, a quiet but very strategic transfer of marital assets to his name alone, filed just weeks before Richard hosted the Tangia party. It wasn't financial stress. It was financial war. And I'd been the soft target, loved, trusted, then drained. That evening, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine and my laptop, scrolling through an old email from a former classmate who had become a lawyer. I typed 3 words into the subject line: "I need help," and hit send, because love may forgive, but betrayal demands receipts. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Lena Rowe, the attorney my classmate had referred me to. Her voice was calm, precise, but there was steel beneath it, like a violin string pulled taut. "I've reviewed everything you sent," she said, "and I'll be honest with you, Rachel. This isn't just deceit. It's strategy, coordinated, intentional, and very likely rehearsed." I met her in a small office downtown. No gold lettering on the door, no mahogany furniture, just books, light, and clarity. She explained in detail how Daniel's asset transfers were consistent with what some divorce attorneys coached men to do before blindsiding their wives. But in this case, she believed Richard had a hand in it too. Lena leaned forward. "Has he ever mentioned estate planning?" I blinked. "You mean Richard?" She nodded. "Yes. Specifically whether there's a trust, a generational transfer, something tied to Daniel." I froze, because just days earlier, Daniel had casually mentioned that Richard was updating his will. At the time, I thought nothing of it. "Standard procedure," he'd said, brushing me off when I asked questions. "Dad wants to make sure things are streamlined in case anything ever happens. It's just paperwork." But Lena's expression told me otherwise. "Rachel," she said slowly, "if you're not in that trust, and if your assets have already been siphoned out of joint accounts, then you're not just being sidelined, you're being erased." I walked out of that office trembling, not from fear, but from realization. It all made sense now. The condescension, the secrecy, the calculated undermining of my career, the insistence that I focus on family, while Daniel and Richard played puppet master behind the scenes. And then came the final blow. Margaret invited us to a dinner. Just family, she said. A quiet evening to discuss upcoming changes. I knew better than to ask what that meant. I dressed carefully, neutral tones, hair tied back, face bare but presentable. When I arrived, the house smelled of roasted duck and deceit. We sat at the table, and Richard, in his usual methodical tone, announced that the Whitman Trust would be restructured. Daniel would assume full control of certain assets, and, in accordance with family interest, All spousal entitlements would remain conditional until future review. In plain English, I got nothing. No vote, no share, not even a name mentioned. I glanced at Daniel. He didn't look at me once. And then, Richard turned to me, that same wolfish smile playing on his lips. You understand, Rachel. Legacy must be preserved. And sometimes that means trimming the branches that grow too freely. I could have cried, could have screamed, could have flipped the entire table and walked out. But instead, I folded my napkin, placed it gently on my plate, and smiled. A smile so calm, so precise, it startled even Margaret. Of course, I said, because in that moment I knew what they feared most. Not my anger, but my silence. Not my exit, but my endurance. The next morning I called Lena. I want a divorce, I told her, but not quietly, not with grace. I want them to feel it. She didn't hesitate. Then we start with discovery. Every document, every dollar, every whisper. And as I ended the call, one thought pulsed through me like a war drum. If they wanted legacy, then I'd show them what happens when a woman reclaims her name. The first thing Lena did was file for an emergency injunction. She wasn't just smart, she was surgical. By the time Daniel got home that night, a formal notice had been delivered to the estate, and an asset freeze request had already landed in the local court system. I expected him to be furious. Instead, he acted surprised. "Rachel," he said, stepping into the kitchen like a scolded schoolboy, "is this some kind of overreaction?" I didn't even look up from my tea. "It's a response." He scoffed. "To what?" "To theft," I said quietly, "and betrayal." He went silent, then launched into a monologue about pressure, legacy, how I didn't understand the burdens of being a Whitman. It was laughable, really. He paced like a man on stage, one hand in his hair, the other gesturing toward invisible ghosts of his ambition. "What do you think you're doing?" he finally asked. "This isn't just about me. This is about my family." "I know," I replied. "That's exactly the problem." The next day, Richard called me directly. No secretary, no middleman. "Rachel," he began, "this circus you've started, it needs to end." "Then let it," I said. "You think you're clever, bringing in outside counsel, freezing accounts, filing for a divorce in a media-sensitive jurisdiction. You're making a mistake." "No," I said. "I made the mistake of thinking I was ever part of this family." There was a pause, just long enough for the air to shift. "I'll make sure you walk away with nothing," Richard said, voice lower now. "You think anyone's going to hire a branding consultant with a reputation for burning bridges?" "I won't need to be hired," I replied. "I've already started building." And then I hung up. That night, Lena sent me an email. You should see this. Attached were copies of bank statements, wire transfers, and internal memos from Richard's firm. Anonymous. Traced back to a source deep inside the Whitman legal network. What they revealed made my breath catch. For years, Richard had been shielding assets in trust structures that were legally ambiguous, possibly fraudulent. Daniel, in turn, had funneled marital funds into these shells, reclassifying shared property as personal legacy holdings. It wasn't just divorce anymore. It was exposure, and that meant leverage. Lena moved fast. She filed for full financial discovery, including subpoenaing Whitman Holdings' ledgers and private accounts. Richard retaliated by launching a smear campaign, leaking that I'd always been unstable, difficult, emotionally erratic. I didn't respond. I let the silence build until it burned. Then I sent him one message. "You taught me everything I needed to dismantle you." By week 3, Daniel was crumbling. His charm turned to panic. He showed up unannounced at my new rental, eyes wide, hand shaking, muttering apologies like they could fill the crater he dug. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said. "We can fix this." "We can't," I replied. "Rachel, please. I didn't know he was planning to cut you out of everything." "But you knew enough to hide the accounts. You knew enough to lie. You were fine as long as I stayed quiet." He opened his mouth to speak again, but I stopped him. There's no reconciliation, Daniel. This isn't about love anymore. This is about truth. And I plan to tell it. His shoulders slumped. He left without another word. And as the door shut behind him, I knew the storm was only beginning. But this time I was the one holding the thunder. The leak hit the local business journal first. An exclusive expose titled "Whitman Legacy Faces Scrutiny Amid Divorce Allegations." Within hours, it spread like fire through legal forums, real estate circles, and finance blogs. Lena had warned me it would be messy. She wasn't wrong. But what she didn't say, and what I quickly realized, was how hungry the public was for a story like this. A woman discarded. A wealthy dynasty exposed. Power, betrayal, inheritance. It had all the makings of a modern Shakespearean tragedy. And I wasn't about to let someone else write the final act. Lena and I had assembled a timeline. Every shady transfer, every paper trail, every missing account suddenly illuminated under the fluorescent lights of forensic accounting. The more we uncovered, the more obvious it became. Richard and Daniel had been playing a long game, but they never expected their pawn to pick up the rulebook. Meanwhile, Daniel's charm began to fracture under pressure. He held a press conference outside his father's firm, stammering about a misunderstanding and private family matters. His voice trembled. His eyes darted. His tie was crooked. He looked exactly like what he was, guilty and unraveling. Richard refused to speak to the press. Instead, he doubled down behind the scenes, trying to buy off-key witnesses, bury subpoenas under layers of delay tactics, and smear me as a vindictive ex-wife. But Lena had anticipated every move. We stayed one step ahead. When a junior associate from Richard's firm offered to testify in exchange for anonymity and immunity, we took it. Her statement confirmed what we suspected. Richard had manipulated the estate planning process to make it nearly impossible for spouses to claim any stake unless they caught him red-handed, which I had. With time running out, Daniel tried again. This time he came with a proposal. Half the accounts. No press. A mutual gag order. He looked tired, not angry, not defensive, just exhausted, like a man who'd finally seen himself clearly and couldn't stand the reflection. He begged, "I'll sign anything. Just make it stop, Rachel. Please." I watched him fumble with the documents, a version of him I never knew. Vulnerable, uncertain, small. "You're not afraid of losing me," I said. "You're afraid of losing the image of you that your father built." He didn't deny it. "Tell me," I continued, "if Richard wasn't watching, would you have ever married me?" Silence. That was all the answer I needed. I stood up, took the unsigned proposal, and slid it back across the table. "I'm not here to negotiate silence," I said. "I'm here to take back what's mine and make sure you never do this to another woman again." Later that week, Daniel signed the divorce papers, but he didn't do it in person. He sent a junior associate to deliver them and signed unsealed with a typed apology letter that ended with, "For what it's worth, I love the version of you that didn't ask questions." I burned that letter the same night. The press continued to circle, but I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid, but because I had already said everything I needed in court, in filings, and the truth that now lived in public record. And as Richard withdrew from the firm to focus on family, I smiled, because for the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me was mine again. I had no mansion, no title, no legacy to inherit, but I had something far better myself. And for the Whitmans, that loss would echo louder than any court ruling ever could. The final court hearing was brief, clinical, almost anticlimactic. Just signatures, acknowledgments, and a gavel falling like a whisper. But behind that silence was a reckoning years in the making. Daniel wasn't there. He sent his lawyer. Richard wasn't seen in public again after the leak about his asset shielding strategy went viral, prompting investigations from not just one, but two regulatory bodies. Their legacy, once etched in glass and gold, was now tainted with footnotes, scandals, audits, whispers in boardrooms. I didn't walk out of court with millions. I walked out with dignity and a ruling that granted me restitution, not just for the stolen assets, but for the emotional damages, something Lena fought hard for, citing a pattern of financial manipulation and psychological coercion. It wasn't just money, it was acknowledgement. 3 months later, I sat in a small sunlit studio overlooking the city. My name was on the lease, the business license framed on the wall behind me. Rachel Whitman, Creative Strategy. I thought about changing the last name. I still might, but for now, it served as a quiet warning. I no longer answered to it. I owned it. My clients were women, founders, artists, single mothers, entrepreneurs. The kind of women who'd been told they were too much or not enough in rooms designed to shrink them. We built brands that didn't ask for permission. We told stories without apology. One afternoon, as I wrapped up a call, I received a message. From Daniel. I'm sorry. No explanation. No plea. Just 2 words, far too late. I didn't reply, because healing isn't an open door for the people who hurt you to walk through again. It's a locked gate, a garden blooming on the other side, where your voice finally echoes louder than theirs. And as I stood by the window, tea in hand, sun warming the scar I used to call a marriage, I smiled, not because I'd won, but because I'd finally stopped needing to prove I had.